It is a delight to be here. So I, with my friend Chris there, for a long time organised cultural evolution and social learning workshops called SLACE, because we were cool like that. So it's really cool to see that the cultural evolution interest remains in ALIFE. So I'm going to sort of talk about open-ended cultural evolution in artificial evolutionary systems. So my motivation for this talk is I don't know what the hell I'm doing in terms of research, an existential crisis that I think we all go through at various points. So I've sort of stopped writing code and writing models. I realized I was sort of rushing to write these ALIFE models, stripping down really what I was trying to do just for the sake of actually getting it to do something. Again, something I'm sure you've all experienced that. I realized I was detaching myself from the questions. So I've sort of stopped coding and started thinking, which those two things should be mutually exclusive, but in my case, they seem to be. So I decided there were 4 questions which I think need to be addressed whenever you're thinking about cultural evolution in an artificial evolutionary system to help ground you in what you're actually trying to do. And in my case, it's within open-endedness. I'm very interested in open-ended evolution. My PhD supervisor was Alistair Channon, who is one of the major figures in open-ended evolution in artificial life. So I've been indoctrinated into thinking it's really important. Whether it is or not, I'll let you guys decide. So these are my 4 questions that I thought were interesting. What is cultural evolution in relation to genetic evolution? Which is a question which is asked all the time. Many of you probably already have an answer to that, but I thought I'd readdress that answer with a really terrible hand analogy. You'll love it. So if cultural evolution is the answer, what's the question? So we seem to be very cultural as a species, probably the most cultural species that exists. So clearly it's an evolutionarily adaptive thing to do. It's an answer. What's the question? What's it trying to solve? How does cultural evolution become open-ended? If it does at all, there's a discussion to be had there. And if open-ended cultural evolution is the end, where was the start? Where does this all start from? I think most of us in ALIFE are interested in bottom-up emergent properties of systems. So cultural evolution is therefore an emergent property of an evolving system. That means it started somewhere, started at the bottom. What was the bottom? Again, not an answerable question, but I'm going to say where I think the useful bottom is from our perspective. Okay, so some definitions. So not all of you would have heard of open-ended evolution, but I think most of you will have done. It's a very, very major, big thing within artificial life. It's one of the big unanswered questions is how you create an artificial evolutionary system that has open-ended evolutionary dynamics. So open-ended evolutionary dynamics are essentially a system producing continuous stream of novel units, an ongoing generation of novelty, adaptations and evolutionary salient entities. There's no a priori limits on the generation of these novelties. Basically, it keeps going. Our artificial evolution systems don't keep going. They stop. Except for Alistair Channon's one system called GEB, but he wasn't convinced by it, so he made the test harder, and it passed it again, and he's still not convinced. So the idea is evolution keeps going, right? That's open-endedness, and we struggle to do that in artificial systems. What's culture? Well, I'm hoping you all know what cultural evolution is, and this is from the workshop title, from the workshop definition. So culture, shared beliefs, values, shared behaviours, values and beliefs, adaptive strategies, traits or ideas that are passed on from generation to generation via social learning. So you see a change in the frequency of these traits over time, therefore it's an evolving system. In the past, I've gone into arguments about whether it's evolving or not. I'm assuming you're all on board with it, that culture being an evolutionary system. If you're not, I'm not having that argument today. Catch me at the pub later. So, artificial life. We all know what artificial life is. Hopefully, we're all familiar with Chris Langton's original conception of what artificial life is. Artificial life is the biology of possible life. This is the study of life as it could be, whose ultimate goal is to extract the logical form of living systems, while biologically focuses almost exclusively on life as we know it. So life as it is instead of life as we know it. Very sci-fi, which is why we all love this field, right? I think we can adjust that slightly to be broader and not just talk about life and evolution from biological entities perspective, but from just a broader evolutionary perspective. So how about we care more about the nature of possible evolution, the study of evolution as it could be, what the foundational conditions of evolutionary systems, not just focusing on Darwinian genetic evolution as we know it. So if cultural evolution is a genuine evolutionary system, see me in a pub afterwards, analogous to but different from Darwinian genetic evolution, then we now have a second evolutionary system from which to extract these general rules, right? So we no longer have to just go genetic evolution, that is evolution, therefore we can extract the rules of evolution from that. We now have another evolving system which acts differently, but analogously. Therefore, we have two systems to look at, therefore we can start extracting fundamental rules from both of them collectively. So this is why I'm interested in cultural evolution, because I think it gives us a different perspective on what it is for a system to evolve, which I think is useful if you're going to try and model these kind of systems. So first of all, the age-old question, how does cultural evolution relate to genetic evolution? These are my terrible hands. That one is really terrifying, the hand on a hand. Thank God for AI-generated art, because I was not going to be able to draw these myself. So the traditional view from people like E.O. Wilson in the 60s and 70s in sociobiology was that culture was just an extension of genetic evolution, just one of many things that evolution has built on top of itself in order to be able to do more stuff. So if evolution is the palm of the hand that can do most things, things like epigenetic inheritance, parental effects, culture are all fingers on that hand, and they were used to do something else. That view isn't the one which most cultural evolutionists take. So Wilson famously described it as genetic evolution holds the leash of cultural evolution. So cultural evolution can never go so far as to undermine the adaptive properties of genetic evolution. That was the argument. Then obviously Dawkins came around in the early 2000s, late 90s, and said, well, actually, there's kind of maladaptive culture. Culture seems to be the one that's holding the leash over genetic evolution. I'm not too keen on that debate or discussion at all. I don't think it's a particularly useful one. So what we could argue instead is that actually it's just recursive, really, that all these features that are branched off from genetic evolution, like cultural evolution, themselves have their own features to do additional stuff. And it's just extra layers of kind of dexterity. So, you know, you've got things like language there and writing and the ability to change your social learning mechanisms and biases in order to fit the context. But really, where cultural evolution is more this option C and option D idea. The idea that culture is, in fact, a kind of another equivalent evolutionary system. Maybe it did start off as something that spawned from genetic evolution. I mean, of course it did. But now it feels like a parallel thing, another hand that enables you to do other things. So the question there is, are they pulling in different directions? Or are they collaboratively working with each other, you know, in order to be beneficial, mutually beneficial, co-evolutionary? I'm more on the side of D, but with AI AI on social media and the kind of the disentanglement of cultural evolution and biological evolution, maybe that isn't the case, but I'm not going to speculate on that. So there is an idea from the cultural evolution literature called triple inheritance theory, which Kevin Leyland, who now goes by Kevin Lala, so if you're looking for him, it's either or. This idea that actually it's better to see genetic evolution and cultural evolution as kind of features of populations. They lead to diverse phenotypes. They're kind of feeding into each other, collaborative, co-evolving. They then lead to niche construction, which creates environments, and environments create the selective pressure for the genes in the culture. And so actually you inherit your gene pool, your culture, and your environment. And I think this is a really useful, nice way of thinking about where culture fits within this whole thing. Probably better than my hand analogy. I just wanted to make AI art do hands, just to check. It can do it, just about. Okay, so next question. If cultural evolution is the answer, what is the question? So one of the questions is, well, one of the things cultural evolution enables you to do is do things quicker and changed how kind of persistence of behavior works. So with genetic evolution, it's slow. If you try and speed it up, it comes with problems. If you increase the mutation rate, you hit the critical mutation rate, in which case you start losing features more often than you keep them, which isn't great for adaptive properties. So not great. So evolution is quite slow, reacts to environments on a less granular scale, but still good. You know, we are all the result of genetic evolution, so it must be good. Evolution then went on to go, okay, well, I need to be able to react on much more granular scales, right? You know, fluctuations in my immediate environment, seasonal changes, not just long-term trends. So let's get some extragenetic inheritance up in here. Let's do some epigenetics. Let's do some parental features. Let's, you know, enable things to be passed on that can adjust or change or be context dependent in the way they're activated. That's good. So now we've kind of got not necessarily great persistence within lifetimes, but, you know, this idea stems from evolution and therefore persists over long-term evolution quite well. Also, we have learning. The idea that within lifetime, you can learn and adapt to your environment quite quickly. Great, learning is good. The problem with learning is it's an individual thing primarily, but it's not, but it starts off that way. Therefore, how did the behavior spread? You have to relearn it every single generation. That's not great. In comes cultural evolution. What you have is you've kind of got high within lifetime persistence. Cultures persist really, really well, and moderately good between lifetime persistence too. So what you're seeing here is evolution, but on a much more granular scale. You can react. You can make the most of the things you learn. You can pass them on. They can be retained. It's useful. So you can see why culture and social learning is an adaptive thing to have for the most case. Also, I did some work back in my PhD to show that if you have individual learning on top of genetic evolution, you can get to kind of behaviors that aren't necessarily easy to get to as part of standard genetic processes, but then you lose them. So in order to keep these new behaviors that you've managed to get by jumping over these areas of negative search space, you know, fitness space, you need social learning to maintain it within the population. But this is all quite obvious stuff, right? It's all quite obvious. In biology, we see a lot of bet hedging. So this is really cool work by a guy called Thomas Ray Halland about different bet hedging strategies. And if you think about an animal's reaction to an environment, when an environment fluctuates, what do? Do you try and fit the environment as it changes? Or do you say, well, I've got a preference. I like it when it's hot instead it's cold. Or do you kind of hedge your bets and go, well, I'm not going to be perfect when it's hot, but I'm not going to be perfect when it's cold, but I'm going to be all right most of the time. And actually, it turns out that if you're considering geometric mean fitness rather than arithmetic mean fitness, so calculating kind of fitness over time rather than at every single kind of point in the population, it's actually much better to do that as a bet hedger than it would be to use arithmetic mean fitness or to be a specialist all of the time. But the problem with this kind of bet hedging approach is you can be outcompeted at various points by specialists. You're not going to die out, but you can be outcompeted. So to my mind, cultural evolution and social learning, and I'm tying these two things up together quite a lot, enables you to have things that are genetically bet hedgers. You know, they kind of work for a range of environments while then doing short-term, quick adaptations to not be outcompeted by specialists. And in many ways, humans are the best example of this, right? We are extraordinarily good at adapting to many different landscapes and environments while all having very, very similar genotypes. So I think the genetic diversity in humans as a species is one of the lowest on the planet at a species level, which is something you should mention to racists because, well, they think different, and that's not the case. So we are very, very genetically homogenous, but behaviorally we're broad. So it enables us to be bet hedgers while also specializing. Best of both worlds. Also, the question of environmental change is important, right? So this here is a thing called I think it's the LRO2 stack, might be LRO4 stack, I don't know. This is a real record of oxygen isotope levels over the last 5 million years. So up is colder, down is warmer. This side Where the 0 is nearer, like now, and in the past, farther away. So you see a general trend to cooling, which you know about, but also look at the jumps, right? The planet has got more variable in its environment, and there are records within Kenya of lakes appearing and disappearing within like a generation or two. So from an evolutionary time perspective, especially for long-lived species like humans, that's almost impossible to react to from a genetic perspective, right? You either have to run away and find the water sources, or you get better at adapting quickly to the changing scenario. And so Rick Potts, who's an anthropologist and archaeologist, suggested that humans didn't evolve to be savanna dwellers or sea dwellers or some specialists in environments. We evolved to be generalists in response to variability. And this is called the variability selection hypothesis. I think it's probably correct. And if you look at periods of kind of pronounced variability, they map really well onto massive turnover in hominin evolution. So we see a massive turnover in the number of species in the hominin species in the fossil record at this period where the environmental variability really shoots up, resulting in, at the end, only 2 or 3 species that we're aware of remaining. And they are Neanderthals, humans, and Homo floresiensis, but I don't know much about Homo floresiensis, I'm afraid. Generally quite social species, especially in the case of humans. So there's a strong argument here that the question is, how do you just deal with variability and change? How do you deal with a world that is changing around you quicker than you can biologically react? So interestingly as well, if you look at the color spectrum of the noise here, it's pink to red, and there's some arguments that a lot of environmental data sets actually represent pink to red noise. So there's some arguments that I've made about how you should use pink to red noise to model environmental variability if you're trying to promote plasticity and kind of behavioral responses. There's a paper on that. I think it won Best Paper a couple of years ago in the ALIFE conference, but it was when it was online, so no one knows about it. And I was asleep when the award was given as well, because I was at home. So there we go. So how does culture become open-ended? How am I doing for time?
You have about 15 minutes.
Yes. So how does culture become open-ended? So we don't know, really. We don't know how anything becomes open-ended. We just don't know. The problem is, in biology, we have an open-ended evolutionary system. It's well established that it's open-ended, though biologists don't really talk about it because, I mean, the system is what they're given. Why do they care about a system that could not be open-ended? Because the system they have is open-ended. So only we care about it. Only we care about systems that are open-ended because we can't make them, and that annoys us. So it's been going on for a long time. So why am I caring about cultural evolution becoming open-ended if we can't even do our own models of biological evolution becoming open-ended? Well, it goes back to that thing at the start. We've got 2 evolutionary systems we can look at that work in slightly different ways. So it helps us attack the problem from 2 perspectives instead of just one. So we might find out something by trying to make open-ended cultural evolutionary systems. Also, it turns out the cultural evolutionists care a little bit about it too. I mean, I was at the conference arguing they should care about it, and 1 or 2 listened. So, but there have been some papers over the last couple of years about open-ended cultural and open-ended technological evolution within the cultural evolution literature, appearing in really, really good journals. And so it's important that we also, as artificial life researchers, maintain our interest in this so we don't lose some say in how that field progresses, because I think it's we have the most to say about it. So one thing that seems to be relatively clear, probably, maybe, this slide's really busy, sorry, is that the only place we see open-ended cultural evolution are in humans. And that's fascinating for a number of reasons. But first of all, let me justify this. So Mark Badeau, who many of you will know, one of the kind of founders and major players in ALIFE for many, many years, has done lots of work on open-ended evolution in technological systems. And he looked at the American patent record over the last 100 years to show just how much change there has been in these kind of categorizations. So here we see those numbers on the side are new categorizations within the patent record. And so you can see those as new species of technological type, a human-imposed species, of course. And then their appearance over time. Some appear, some disappear, some disappear for a while, then reappear again. Some become very, very dominant, some are retained. If you look at any attempt at an open-ended evolutionary system in ALIFE, this is what we're looking for. we are looking for persistence of adaptive novelty. Well, some of these newer pattern record categories seem to be an adaptive response to cultural evolutionary change or technological requirements that then persist. They don't just disappear, they exist, and then they are useful and they are retained. That's an evolutionary system. There's selection, there's variation, there's mutation, so that's variation. So it seems relatively clear that human cultural evolution is open-ended. There seems to be no reason for us to think there's a finite set of cultural things we are possible for us to create. We also see alongside this turnover of hominin species also quite a rapid turnover in what archaeologists call modes of technology. So like mode 1, which is very, very simple kind of stone tools, to mode 2, where they start getting more refined, to mode 3, where they start getting more complex, to mode 4, which is pretty much everything we've had in the last couple of thousand years, really kind of very complex, cumulative culture. Actually, I think all of them are cumulative. I forget. But anyway, so we see a human technological response that doesn't seem to be simplifying or stopping as a response to environmental change. And the reason I say it's only humans that have it, probably, is that while there are countless examples of culture within animals, and Andy Whiten has written many papers on this, but he wrote one a few years ago which kind of summarized it really, really well. What we don't see, at least in my opinion, Andy Whiten disagrees with me on this, is open-ended cultural evolution in those species. And so Claudio Teni, who's a collaborator of mine, has come up with a theory called the zone of latent solutions. This is really controversial still within the cultural evolution field. The cultural evolutionist in the room is laughing because he knows it's really acrimonious. Like you're in one team or you're in the other, and they're not allowed to talk to each other, but they do. It's very, very Romeo and Juliet. But Claudio is a primatologist / archaeologist / jack of all trades. And he's done a lot of studies with people like Karel van Schaik on ape culture. And his view is that most apes are only producing behaviors that they could individually learn on their own and then using social learning and cultural mechanisms to spread them quickly and robustly. But there's nothing new being created as a result of that cultural evolution. There's no novelty being created. Everything that they do, they could have done without culture. They just would have taken longer. And that's why we're only seeing a limited subset of ape tool use behavior, for instance, and not seeing them innovate new things, or at least not seeing them innovate new things very often. So that's Claudio's argument. He knows more about it than me. I'm going to believe him. Some people don't believe it. Some people think that it's not a good measure. Other people have suggested that maybe we just haven't looked for long enough in terms of archaeological time. We've got quite a lot of human archaeology, right? And there was a long period of time where we only had mode 1 technologies, which are very, very simple. So if someone, an alien, was to jump in during that mode 1 technology stage and look back over what they could see archaeologically, it looked like we weren't changing much. From at least an archaeology and technology perspective, it looked relatively static. So maybe it's just the case that chimps are just further down, or other apes, gorillas, for instance, are just further back in the cultural evolutionary timescale. Another great example of this are whales. So there's been some long studies on whale song now, and there's lots of really great data sets on how whale song evolves over time. There's some arguments for whether or not it's drift or whether or not it's selected for. There's some discussions about that. But if we look for long enough, we might see some real, genuine, open-ended cultural evolution of whale song if we keep looking for long enough. Because we've only been looking for a very short amount of time. So maybe we're jumping to conclusions here. But at least in humans, we have something that we are relatively certain is an open-ended cultural evolutionary system. And so we can look at human culture as a model that we can kind of be inspired by in our own research. There's also been lots of discussions about how you break out of like the zone of latent solutions or these kind of limited repertoires of behaviors. How does that work? Well, there's some work by Maxime Dereks, who's another cultural evolution guy, and he wrote a paper a couple of years ago about what he calls type 1 and type 2 cumulative cultural evolution. I'm not going to get too into cumulative culture because that, again, is a big thing in the cultural evolution world. The idea of cumulative culture is the idea of culture that is ratcheted up over time. So like a ratchet, you get some behaviors, they're fixed. They're retained in a population. And then you then build on it and ratchet it, and you build on it and ratchet it, and that's how humans can build spacecraft. But now everyone's decided that every animal has cumulative culture, so its value is sort of devalued as an explanation for human uniqueness. So put the cumulative aside, he thinks there's two types of this kind of more complex cultural evolution. Type 1, which is essentially optimization, as we see in chimps. They get better and better at using the sticks for ant and termite fishing. And then type 2 is when, after you've reached some sort of plateau, you manage to open up new natural phenomena or new search spaces. So the technology you have enables you to then look into new search spaces or exploit new natural phenomena, which then enables you to optimize for that. And then eventually you can then jump to another stage and another stage. So it's the idea of opening up search spaces or exploiting new niches or exploiting new natural phenomena. And we see this as humans all the time, right? We exploit subatomic particles now that we couldn't have perceived a couple of hundred years ago through technological innovation. James Winters has got a paper that's currently being reviewed, but you can find it on arXiv about building a really simple evolutionary model of this. It's a very ALIFE sort of model, so definitely worth looking at, about how search spaces and technology spaces can evolve together to create something like open-ended evolutionary dynamics. But then Maxine talks about how does this actually happen? And the only way we can really see this happening is through cognitive changes. And we see in humans, brain size change is the clearest one we see in humans, right? You know, human brains are bigger than kind of other hominin brains. There's been a general trajectory upwards. We also see an increase, or we believe an increase in neural density. Human neural density is really, really high. Human neural interconnectedness is really, really high. So it seems that you need to get this kind of ramping up of cognitive capacity to be able to open up these new natural phenomena, to explore, or at least be able to perceive them. Problem with that from a ALIFE point of view is when we make neural networks, they're fixed in size. We almost never allow our neural networks to evolve in size, unless using things like NEAT, which I think is really cool. We don't. We go, there's our neural network, there it is. Now we might use the big LLM models, you know, the big generative models that are just too big. They're just ridiculously large, and no one knows why they're doing what they're doing because they've got billions of parameters, which feels rubbish to me as an ALIFE researcher because it's not very bottom up. So I think we need to start accounting for the fact that we need to have brain size or cognitive development in our models alongside other emergent properties, because these all evolve together. And then you could maybe get this kind of relentless movement towards greater complexity. But of course, we're limited in terms of computational power and our own ability to conceive these kind of models because it's hard. And this is why I haven't created a model for a while, because it's really, really hard. So my very last set of slides. If cultural evolution, open-ended cultural evolution is the end, where's the start? Where do we all start from? In ALIFE, we jump to the middle a lot because we don't want to go all the way down to chemicals, or some artificial chemists do, because it's too complicated and you don't get far enough. So we jump in at the behavioral level or the language level. But where should we start when thinking about cultural evolution as an emergent property of a system? Well, a while ago, Andy Whiting created this pyramid, which I've never seen him use, so I don't think he likes it anymore. The idea that you start off with social information transfer. In some cases, that becomes traditions, which generally you don't talk about as much anymore, which leads to culture, which leads to cumulative culture. But my conception of this is you start with public information. Any animal or any organism that can perceive its surroundings can accidentally perceive somebody else doing something, right? They might not know it's the result of someone else's behavior, but they can still use that information in order to affect their behavior. You know, this feels like this surface is different to what this surface was before. Maybe that means something. Then over time, you can start perceiving social information, kind of actively expressed information, like birdsong, for instance, or things that are less complicated than that. So then, you know, someone else has told me this. I will use that information to adjust my behavior. Then if you add learning into the mix, you can start learning and building learning biases to be context dependent in how and when you apply these things. If you do that often enough, you can get traditions. You could argue that's just a culture in one domain. So I think Andy Whiting used it as, they have culture, but only in one domain of behavior. I'm not sure how useful it is as a term anymore. That leads to culture, which is a variety of kind of domain-specific behavioral traits, which are frequent, within that population for an arbitrary reason, right? Like fashion, why do you wear these clothes and the other person wears that clothes? It's a cultural thing, but there's no real adaptive advantage in most cases for one over the other from a biological perspective. And then goes to open-ended cultural evolution. So where can we start? I think you can start with public and social information. If you have an artificial agent that has access to that information with a simple neural network that itself can develop in the right kind of environment, all these things sound easy when you say them until you actually try and do them, you might get the emergent trajectory to lead to things like culture, and maybe, if your model is complex enough, open-ended culture. So it's about where you start. And this also feeds into what the major evolutionary transitions were, with the idea that this eusocial social insects are an evolutionary transition from what happened before. It's a big transition that happened. I'm starting at that transition and then saying, let's start at that transition and then move forward, or see if we can move forward to the social, the societies, the institutions, and more complex things. I'm making it sound easy. I'm not doing it because it's hard. So I brushed through that a little bit. Finally, my big crazy slide. I have this theory called the cultural primordial ooze. I think we are looking at right now the cultural primordial ooze. We have in humans an open-ended cultural evolutionary system that is working in competition against the cultural evolutionary systems of all other animals, right? And we're out competing them in a pretty tragic way, right? You know, our changes to the environment, you know, why we build our own environments on top of theirs, all because we have open-ended cultural evolution. So there was a large selection pressure for those species that are able to quickly adapt to the changes we're applying to them. So what we're seeing is a competition of various different cultural evolutionary systems at once that feels to me analogous to when we would have seen various different competing replicator systems in kind of early primordial Earth. We are seeing the very start of a new evolutionary system competing with other evolutionary or other variations in that evolutionary system in real time. So we are sort of able to do evolutionary systems archaeology by looking at what's happening in the dynamics between cultural evolution in humans and cultural and behavioral evolution in other animals. That's my idea. Now I need to flesh this out a bit because actually it's totally flimsy and up in the air. By the way, that's what AI thinks the cultural primordial looks like. I like it. Some bedtime reading. This is a paper I wrote a few years ago with a bunch of some ALIFE and some non-ALIFE collaborators about open-ended cultural evolution. I think it's a good paper. You should read it. And also there's a book that Kevin Lala and Marcus Feldman and others have written recently called Evolution Evolving. I've read the first couple of chapters. It's great. It's all about all the different types of extra genetic inheritance systems that exist and how they're all part of a wider extended evolutionary synthesis, which is a whole other arguments going on as well. There's lots of arguments. If you do want a book to read, that's a really well-written book. It's exceptionally good. It's exceptionally informative. I've probably left no time for questions.
Thanks so much, James. We have enough time for a few questions. Who raised their hand first? I couldn't see actually.
I'll let someone else go.
No,
I just don't
that's
want to troll.
Don't troll me. Don't.
Okay.
He's like, why am I not the keynote? I organised those workshops with you too.
Yeah. Okay, James, this was a really good talk. I really liked it. I shared lots of your opinions on cultural evolution. You know that already. My question's about open-endedness, and I'm going to make it a little challenge. I would claim that we don't have any open-ended evolutionary systems. What we have are closed-ended systems, and then we make major transitions from one to another. So we're in biology, it's closed-ended. It was trying to solve something and said, I can't do it, so we transition into culture. Culture opens up new space. I think you had that partly in your talk about how the technology, right? Our technology opens up the space for us to do it. What do you think about that perspective?
So I'd say the fact you can keep having transitions is open-ended evolution.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not you disentangle the two systems, an open-ended cultural evolutionary system and an open-ended genetic evolutionary system, or whether or not actually they're all part of the same open-ended system, I think actually that is the case.
They're all part of one.
They're all part of one system, but the genetic one on its own seems to be open-ended even without culture.
So my challenge on that is maybe we haven't looked long enough.
I mean, maybe, and that's fine, and that's good. And I'm fine for that to be the answer.
But is that the current answer in biology, is that it just seems like it's open-ended, like we looked at it and it seems it? Or is there...
I think the answer from ALIFE is we looked at it and it seems open-ended. Mark Badeau produced some metrics for calculating activity statistics. They did this in the 90s and applied it to the fossil record and it looked open-ended. But it's one of those things, it's like everything in AI, it sort of doesn't actually mean anything because it's really hard to actually state the precise definition of it. So it is one of those general human senses that it is open-ended. And of course, there's limited energy in the universe. So of course it can't be open-ended because eventually the universe will reach maximum energy. There'll be the heat death of the universe. But for all intents and purposes, it looks like there's no reason for it to stop outside of those constraints. So whether you disentangle those two things or keep them together, I don't think it really matters so much. I think it's nice to look at cultural evolution as a separate evolutionary system. Also because it looks like you can detach it from human biological evolution, right? You know, the dead internet theory suggests there's an awful lot of cultural evolution going on the internet, which is just AIs talking to each other and arguing. So maybe you don't need biological evolution anymore, and maybe it is a totally separate evolutionary system. The biology just plays a part in our species.
Thanks so much. My question is also another about open-endedness, like your usage of open-endedness. So I see probably like if I understand, you use open-ended culture evolution as a kind of more certainly broader than just a cumulative culture, I guess.
Yeah.
So so maybe in the last two slides, something like you compare like a anti-Whiten version and your version, and probably like an earlier slide you showed some non-human animals could some animals might have cumulative culture but might not be open-ended enough. But and then you said our human culture is uniquely unique because it could be seen as a open-ended. But how? I'm wondering. My question is probably like the relationship between this open-endedness and cumulativeness.
Yeah.
Is it like a kind of 2x2? So which means, is it possible to come up with open-ended but non-cumulative culture?
So actually, in the paper that we wrote, that one there, we talk about that a little bit. So I think cumulative culture was people like Tomasello trying to articulate what actually is open-endedness, but articulating it in such a way that left open the possibility for others to then measure cumulative culture in other species. Fine, but like there's studies about cumulative culture in pigeon homing, right? That's not the same as building a rocket. It isn't the same, but the definition of cumulative culture works. So my opinion, and I'm following Andy Buskell on this, is cumulative culture is a useless definition and we should ditch it. And what we're really talking about is animal cultures which are a variety of levels of complexity but are fundamentally limited. They're sort of type 1, as Maxine calls them. And then human culture, which seems to be the only one which has got what Maxine calls type 2, the ability to exploit and continue exploiting and discovering new natural phenomena. And I think it is possible for you to have a non-cumulative, open-ended system in theory. I don't think you can necessarily in reality, but we talk about that in the paper a little bit about path dependency, and you can have non-path dependent evolution, and that in theory could be open-ended. But yeah, that's a whole other talk. Yeah.
So how about like an oscillating, but it's not cumulative, but interesting oscillating system, for example, is it like open-ended?
I think it could be in theory. I think it's much harder to achieve than in a path-dependent cumulative system. I think all open-ended systems that we see are cumulative, but I don't think that is theoretically necessary. I think you can have them without, but I think it'll be harder.
Thanks so much, James. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, so maybe in the break you can catch James and chat about it. So let's give another round of applause. So up next, I'd like to introduce Ryutaro Uchiyama. Ryu is an assistant professor at Singapore University of Technology and Design, where he leads the Human Cognitive Ecology Lab, and he teaches cognitive and computational neuroscience. He obtained his PhD in psychological and behavioral science from the London School of Economics, where his advisor was Michael Mukherjee. He did his postdoc at the Tübingen AI Center at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics in Germany. He's published on quite a few related topics to this workshop, but most relevant is his work on the cultural evolution of genetic heritability, where he showed that cultural effects can inflate heritability estimates, which I think is very interesting. And he also has used the reinforcement learning framework to study cultural evolution of world models. So go ahead and take it away.
Hi, everyone. So this is my title. I'm going to talk about developmental complexity. It's a somewhat ambiguous term, but just to make it a bit more clear, what I'm actually talking about here is how we think about environments. Different fields that study learning or behavior each have their own implicit conception of the environment. But often, environment takes a back seat. Just like in a narrative, you follow the protagonist, or in sports, you follow the pitcher in baseball. We just have a mental habit of focusing on the agent, and the environment is often assumed. My original foray into academic ideas was through actually something similar to ALIFE. I'm new to this conference, but in Japan, as you can see, there's a pretty bustling scene. And I was into philosophy, and there's one philosopher biologist called Hideo Kawamoto who was translating Maturana and Varela's work. And I got really interested into autopoiesis. And I realized, in retrospect, that actually some of these ideas is probably influenced by that. And so the idea there is that there's no agent environment as separate entities, although you can see it like that if you choose from the observer's perspective. But the agent is carving out its own environment. This is my overview slide, just one slide on cultural evolution. So we all know about genetic evolution. Then we also have this idea of cultural evolution. Instead of two biological parents, you can get ideas, behaviors, norms, values, all of these different kinds of things from different individuals in your society, also horizontally from your peers. And because the idea is that in culture, just as in genetic evolution, you have processes of selection, generation of variation, and inheritance. You can think of it as an evolutionary system where behaviors and practices are spreading and persisting via cycles of innovation and selective diffusion through transmission means like imitation or norm conformity. So for a long time, the key idea of why human behavior and human culture is so different is that there's this special trait called cumulativity. So James talked about cumulative cultural evolution. Just like James, I'm not going to talk so much about cumulative cultural evolution, but just to put it out there that this has often been a central rationale. And the idea is that in many species, you might innovate a new behavior. There might be a chimpanzee, Leonardo da Vinci, but when the chimpanzee da Vinci dies, his ideas and genius dies with him. But in humans, we can sometimes pass on these ideas. I'm sure there are many Einsteins who have died in the rice fields, but nonetheless, we have ways of preserving the information and behavioral innovation beyond the death of the author. So that's often been described with the metaphor of a ratchet. So people point out that today the metaphor of ratchet is not a good one because people don't use ratchets anymore, and it's kind of a very foreign thing. But recently, there's also this idea of maybe open-endedness is the thing that distinguishes human culture, because it turns out cumulativity, it does appear in many forms, not only in other species, but in this review paper by Morgan and Feldman, they were also looking at multiple forms of extragenetic inheritance, including parental effects, like the microbiome that you inherit from your mother when you go through the birth canal, for example, or epigenetic effects. So it turns out that the scope of our behavioral variation, this is the one thing that you don't find, even if you survey all these different species and different forms of lines of inheritance. And it's just obvious that just the range of the behaviors we perform, there's something quite special about it. Another thing I have in common with James is that we are both collaborators with Claudio Tenier. So it's true that the idea of a zone of latent solutions has been contentious, but this review, it recently published in Nature Human Behavior, it's basically saying something very similar. And here, Morgan and Feldman, both great researchers, and Feldman, many would consider one of the pioneers or the founders of the field of cultural evolution, originally working with Cavalli Sforza, looking at a language and genetic transmission. I think maybe we're at a turning point, and we have to admit that there actually chimpanzee behavior is not as open-ended and flexible as we would like to think it is. It's quite impressive, right? They're very dexterous, clearly high intelligence. So, Claudio Tenier has been working with chimpanzees and other apes for a long time. So it's just obvious to people like him because you try to get chimpanzees to do something like this, okay? Like something like this, very easy. Probably can get a 3-year-old to do it. No matter how much reward you give to a chimpanzee, you cannot get them to do it because it's that's not within their behavioral repertoire. So I'm going to move this. However, we kind of we don't want to say this because it makes chimpanzees somehow sound a bit stupid or something. But this is not a deficit. The fact that they don't have an unlimited behavioral range, this is actually a hard-won solution to the problem of learning. So the problem of learning, different fields study it. Of course, a lot of people here study it. Psychologists, cognitive scientists, artificial intelligence researchers, each have their own take on learning. But each of these fields typically just looks at one form of uncertainty in the environment. Again, the environment, right? But actually, we need to bring together these different forms of uncertainty in the environmental task structure and also behavior in general that these different fields study. And then we can begin to understand why this limited behavioral range is actually what you expect. It's humans that are the weirdos, okay? It's not that chimpanzees have some kind of a deficit, okay? Yeah, so this problem formulation, I'm calling it a dual motor environment complexity. Different fields study it. So just looking within AI alone, so you have different kinds of AI methods. So there are some or many that look at a simple task environment. It's like how far can you get a humanoid to go, but a complex action space. So many degrees of freedom in this humanoid body, difficult to control. In other cases, you have a simple action space, like in a game like Go, but of course it's a very complex task environment, notoriously. But real environments, real behavioral ecologies combine both complex actions and complex environments. And so once you consider that, if you think about the way human learning in particular, is often studied in the lab, it's just very insufficient for capturing many aspects of behavior. Just the key press, this minimal input, of course, is for tractability. You probably cannot analyze the data in a reliable way unless you do this kind of minimization in some aspects of the interaction of the agent with the task. But I'm going to argue that this omits something very important. So I'll talk about each of these forms of complexity in turn. First is motor complexity. So if any of you have taken a movement science class, this is very well known in this field. So this is fields like sports science, motor neuroscience, rehabilitation. So the Soviet physiologist Bernstein formulated this a long time ago as a degrees of freedom problem. So the human brain controls up to 600 muscles and about 350 joints, depending on how you count, to generate outcomes in a 3-dimensional or 6-dimensional, if you're also counting the Euler dimension, the orientation space. So in biology, geneticists are very familiar, but it's called degeneracy. There are many, many different ways to implement this one action of moving the apple across the table. Therefore, efficient motor control requires the learning of low-dimensional constraints. So these are, it comes in many forms, but one very famous one is called muscle synergies. And so each of these rows with the horizontal bar plots, those are names of muscles in the hand. And then it turns out that the motor cortex, even though it has access to each muscle independently, it's not controlling them independently. So think of it's like a 600-key piano. Okay, that's very hard for the motor cortex to play. So it simplifies it, and it literally is a principal components analysis. So it's just uncontroversial that you can recreate muscle synergies by doing a PCA. And so it turns out that these are the first 3 PCAs, or synergies, as the movement scientists call it. And so each is a linear combination of the output of each of these muscles. But then there's also a time course where synergy 1 is ramping up very quickly early on, whereas synergy 2 and 3 are have the later onset. And so by combining these primitives, you get very flexible behavior and approximation, and you don't need such a high dimensionality like you see in these numbers here with the muscles and joints in order to act adaptively in the world. So this makes sense, right? However, there's also a downside to this, namely that it restricts learning new skills. And in the study of motor control, so some of you might be familiar with people like Michael Jordan, and some computational researchers have been proposing these. But there's one paradigm called optimal feedback control, which is quite influential. And this is a kind of model where you're trying to minimize a loss function, which includes things like the amount of movement, also acceleration and the jerk that is received by your arm, and also the risk of missing the target, things like that. And so actually, any kind of variability in movement or noise is just inefficiency. It's noise. Variability is noise in this case. But recently, in the movement sciences literature, there's a group that's partly influenced by reinforcement learning, partly influenced by the study of a bird song in the basal ganglia analog in birds. There is something that strongly resembles a random pattern generator, and this is important for learning bird song. So this has been well known for a long time. Michael Fee and others have been studying this for a long time. But the idea is that maybe it's not so surprising. So in humans too, aside from peripheral noise or peripheral variability that occurs just through error, you also have a central noise or a planning noise that is centrally generated in the nervous system. And the idea is that this facilitates learning and emergence of new skills. So very much related to this is the idea of coordinative variability. And you can think of this basically as how many degrees of freedom are you using in your body. And if you look at very old people or kids, very young kids, they often have reduced degrees of freedom. So an old person, if you see some old politicians talking, sometimes you see their hands moving like this. So it's all constrained into one thing. And this right away gives the impression of being maybe not so sharp. So you sort of know it when you see it. But we know, for example, that when you have reduced degrees of freedom in your movement, this increases the risk of injury. But the idea here is that it's not just that. It also impedes learning as well. So what are we learning, right? What is it that we need to learn? It's not just being able to move flexibly and do yoga and things like that. It really depends on the structure of the environment. So just one example of what I mean by the structure of the environment, or here I call it the task environment. We can call it different things. Just take the simple pouch with a zipper, okay? Maybe some of you have this right now, or maybe you've used it when you were in secondary school, primary schools. In Japan, you collect a lot of pens, and you put in these kind of things. And if you go back to your early memory of using these pouches, opening and closing it is not a problem. The problem is how cool is my color scheme of my pen case compared to my friends. But early on, if you look at these bar plots, these from about 2 years old to 3 years old, it's very difficult for kids to open this because you need to hold a very specific part of the pouch, this blue part, and also the angle of the zipper also needs to be low enough. Otherwise, you have either incorrect stabilization or incorrect pull. So you don't think twice when you see this kind of pouch with a zipper, but actually you had to learn this. It's literally a model of the physics of the pouch with the zipper, right? You compiled in your brain the way the physics of this thing works, and it probably took you at least a year. And if you're already deciding, okay, so this is the range of things I need to do, and I'm going to just fix my motor system into this low-dimensional coordination structure, then how can you learn these new skills that require subtle movements that actually require to break the covariance of these muscles that are joined together in their activation in this PCA-like manner that is called motor synergy. So just to back up a little bit, this is very much related to the idea of world models. And there are different ways you can think about world models. One familiar and relatively simple way to think of it is the transition function of a Markov decision process. In this case, there's 3 discrete states, and then 2 actions that you can choose in each state in this image with the cars. But of course, realistically, actually, it's much more complex, and it's going to be continuous and much more subtle along many dimensions. And so just like this child who is rolling this ball toward this tower, maybe intending to knock it down. So one influential idea within computational cognitive science is that we all have a physics engine in our brain. So it's intuitive physics. And the important thing is that this physics model in our brain is not capturing everything about the structure of the environment, because actually you don't need to know every aspect. It's just some key aspects. And the kind of approximations that we make are very similar to the kind of approximations that game designers make when they take shortcuts in designing their 3D worlds. And you can test this in the lab. But a more realistic way to think about this is as a meta-learning. So in this case, it's a meta-reinforcement learning. But meta-learning is the idea that you're not trying to optimize for one particular environment or one particular task, which is often the way machine learning is used, but actually a distribution of environments where the properties of that distribution are not fully known. So sometimes it's called learning to learn. And so clearly, this has some link to open-endedness. So that's task environment complexity. The amount of complexity in task structure, including a future task structure or future environments, that should determine how much complexity we allow ourselves to live with in the motor system. Because if we're unable to use our 4 fingers independently, maybe it's okay in some worlds, but in others they are not. So, hold on. So, going back to real behavioral ecologies, okay, so you find yourself in this environment, you're growing up in this environment, you are adroit enough that you can get your food and stay alive. But to be able to function efficiently in this environment, you are slowly discovering the low-dimensional manifold within this high-dimensional motor coordination space, and that's good enough for this environment, okay? But then how do you get from here to these kind of skills, given the uncertainty you have in the domain of motor complexity and also in environmental complexity? So this is the problem formulation which is my starting point. To investigate this gap that I'm describing here, in my empirical work, I've started studying human behavioral creativity. And the idea is that it's not environmentally determined. So the fact that we can decouple our motor coordination structure from the actual structure of the environment, I think this is something that's very important. And I think it may help explain human open-endedness. I just started this research, so I'm not going to talk much about it, but it's using the methods from movement sciences in a movement lab. And we start with kinematic data coming from motion capture cameras. And then we embed this into a low-dimensional embedding space and cluster it, and then look at people's trajectories as they're moving and interpret it as a time series across clusters. And then we do some inference to infer what their internal model of the task structure as well as their motor coordination structure is. So then the idea is to use turn this into a game, an MDP, so that you can set the reward somewhere within this joint coordination structure that you're not using. So the example I showed to my friend yesterday is if you can put your hands on the table, maybe you can all do this for me. Put your both hands on the table, turn one into a fist like this. Okay, do this with your fist, pound on it, and can you also turn your hand in a circle like this, flat? It's a little bit hard, right? So if you grew up in an ecology where that's very important, then this would have become independent. But because that's usually not so important, they have become correlated. And so you need to consciously dissociate this. And so this is one part of your motor coordination space that you don't normally use. It's not such an intuitive action. If I ask you to just perform a random action, just do some random action, people do like this. It's not very random. It seems relatively random compared to I don't know, like this or something. But we just don't have a conception of what our movement space where it extends to and what's actually possible If you're a dancer or an athlete or a yogi, probably you know a lot more. But even then, there are probably a lot of regions of this motor coordination space you're not using. And then we can compare individuals, the way they expand their repertoire, motor repertoire. And then the idea is to extract metrics of creativity that are based on traditional tests of creativity. But these traditional tests of creativity are usually verbal creativity. Like you have a microphone here. Give me as many alternative uses of this microphone as you can. That kind of verbal creativity. It's still used. It's created in the 20th century. Yeah, you know, that's something important, but I think it's a bit limited. So I'm quite interested in this embodied creativity, especially because this idea that maybe there's something about human embodied creativity that's a little bit different, human open-endedness. It's just what it looks like in the movement lab. And so this whole idea is quite influenced by Lev Vygotsky. Maybe some of you are familiar with him. He's a Soviet psychologist who had some really interesting ideas about how the social environment scaffolds the learning of behavior. So people like Mike Tomasello have been quite influenced by Vygotsky. I have too. So in this case, society is part of the developmental environment. So up to here, what I've been talking about is not that directly linked to cultural evolution. And again, I'm not going to talk about cumulativity and things like that. But from here, I'll make a bit of a transition and talk about this Vygotskian way of thinking. So in this game too, the system of reward and the real-time feedback. So that's a form of scaffolding. Okay, so I guess I have 15 minutes left, 10 minutes left. Okay, yeah. Let me just see how many. Okay, yeah. So development. Okay, so we haven't really talked about development so far. There are a few ways you can think about development, but one pair of concepts that sort of makes sense to me is development as convergence and development as divergence. So convergence, people like Alison Gopnik have used the metaphor of a simulated annealing. And so there's some unknown landscape, some objective function, and then overdevelopment. You're trying to figure out, oh, okay, I can't just fly if I flap my hands. I can't use telekinesis to knock over your water bottle. And the causal structure of the world gradually starts to converge. And hopefully we all converge on somewhat similar models of the world. But this is a very just a stochastic optimization kind of perspective. And if you think of it of development in a bit more terms of agency, you can also start thinking about development as divergence. So if you have self-organizing trajectories of development, then so you can think of it as a chaotic dynamics, if you like. So this is sort of what I want to discuss. So of course, there's also open-ended AI, which I guess is has a long history that is intertwined with ALIFE, I believe. So open-ended AI. So a lot of these algorithms, they are also oh, sorry, just one thing I forgot to mention. The important thing here is that the environment is not an exogenous variable. Okay, in development, people often treat environment as a given. So we already know the environment. Okay, then how is learning occurring? How is development occurring? So in a lot of fields, like I said in the very beginning, right? That's the thing that happens. So in open-ended AI, intelligence is often built into the way they create environmental variation. And so, you know, you guys are, many of you are more familiar than I am, but I think for cultural evolution people who may not be so familiar with the open-ended AI algorithms by people like Kenneth Stanley, it's quite interesting because the very successful ones are usually co-evolutionary systems where the environment and the agent are co-evolving. So in the case of a poet, so you have this relatively simple agent that is learning how to just traverse the environment. But what you're doing is just generating a lot of variation in the environment. And then that just makes it better and better at learning in new environments. So this is an example of open-ended algorithm. Another by Jeff Clune, somewhat similar, but in this case, it's somewhat more sophisticated 2D environments or 3D. And what we're doing here is you're getting an agent to solve different tasks, and then you're evolving the task space. And it's really like an evolutionary system where you're getting branching out tasks. And so it's you know it's great for cultural evolutionists and maybe you know evolutionists in general that these kind of co-evolution dynamics are coming in so handy. But of course, in reality, you can't just evolve the environment like that, right? And the agent itself is quite simple. The structure of generating environmental variation and selection, that's sort of the complex part. Okay, but we can think of something similar, an analog in the domain of biological behavior and development. So here's a study that I like a lot. It's quite a famous study. Some of you might even be familiar with it. So in this study by Frund et al., they put mice in an enriched environment and a control environment. So this task design itself is pretty common. So the key thing here is that they use cloned mice. So there's no genetic difference, okay? But it turns out that there's a lot of variation in the way the mice develop. And the variation is a lot larger in the enriched environment than in the control environment. And you can tell this by looking at all these different variables, like a brain weight. The average brain weight is not that different, but the variability in the brain weight is much, much bigger in the enriched environment. Also, something like adult hippocampal neurogenesis. So compared to the baseline and the end, so you are getting a reduction in neurogenesis in the hippocampus as you would expect in all mammals, but it's retained at a much higher level in the enriched environment. Also, this is a separate study, but you get mice to do a series of behavioral tasks. So this is kind of a mouse general cognitive ability, or mouse IQ. And so at the end of this study, you can compute the heritability. So the heritability is the variation in the outcome variable. So in this case, the performance on this battery of tasks. How much of that is explained by variation in genes versus environment, or everything else that's not genes, basically. And you see that the heritability, so how much of the performance is explained by genetics, that is much higher in the control environment. In the enriched environment, genes matter much less, for a similar reason to why there's so much more variability in these behavioral and neurological outcomes as well. There are just so many more possible developmental trajectories that can be pursued within this enriched environment. And it's not just averaging out. It is a kind of a self-organizing process where initial fluctuations, initial small differences can result in habits and ultimately just a very different behavior patterns, even though genetically all the mice are the exact same. So we can think about culture in this way too. So these are some ideas from a paper that I published with my PhD supervisor in behavioral and brain sciences a few years ago. So wait, I have 5 minutes left?
Yeah, 5 minutes. You
okay.
can go a little bit longer.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try to. Okay, got about 5 or 6 more slides. So think of something I'm not sure how familiar you all are with genetic effects, but if you just take, let's say, one allele that is associated with either pigmented skin or less pigmented skin, so dark skin or light skin, right? And then, of course, it's actually not just one gene that is regulating this. There's a lot, but as a thought experiment, okay, you just think of it as one gene, one locus. Okay, so what's the genetic effect? If you take something, an outcome variable, like a skin cancer, so most of us know that darker skin protects against UV in hotter climates. And so this means that if you're comparing a pair of people or two groups in Rio de Janeiro or London, transposing them to one or the other will change the genetic effect because the environmental challenge is a lot less in a place like London, which is very cloudy. So I think that's you can understand that, right? You can also have a similar effect, just staying in Rio or just staying in London, have a counterfactual world where there is sunscreen and there's no sunscreen, right? Because sunscreen is a technological innovation that also protects against UV. So in a world without sunscreen, there's going to be a large genetic effect where the genes matter more in the outcome of skin cancer risk. And then with sunscreen, it's going to matter less. So this is why the highest rates of skin cancer are in places like Australia, where the majority population there, the skin tone is mismatched with the climate. So there's been a vigorous policy attempts to try to encourage people to use sunscreen. So, okay, we're just saying it's a parallel, and you can think of sunscreen and also this ecological variable latitude in a similar way. But what's the difference here? The difference here is that sunscreen is just one of many technological or behavioral innovations, and this is it's open-ended because cultural evolution is open-ended, at least the way we observe it. And if you just look at something like the diffusion of these different household technologies, this is just to give you a mental image of how cultural evolution works. It's a diffusion process. So there's some innovation, and then this spreads across the population. And the rate of spread can vary in different societies. In a society with that is highly conformist, or maybe shares the same language, or doesn't have many natural barriers, whatever the reason is, it's less clustered, meaning that innovations will diffuse more quickly. And this suggests that the heritability of some outcome variable that's associated with that cultural technology or behavior that's transmitted by culture, this should also vary as a function of these cultural transmission parameters. And so I'm not going to explain it here, but we have a very simple mathematical model that shows how different kinds of societies should show different patterns of heritability across time. So this idea is also very much related to something like niche diversity. So the idea, you might have heard of the big five. So personality structure, you can, if you do factor analysis, you get 5 components. The ocean is the acronym. But actually, there was this idea that if you go to some societies, like the Chimane, who are a hunter-gatherer society in the Amazon, you can explain it with a 2-factor structure. So 2 factors are the best fit to explain the variation in personality. And so this idea has been around for a long time. So recently, one group did a fairly rigorous study. So it turns out that it's not necessarily 2, but you do find that societies with more niche diversity, so this means a variety in the kind of livelihood, the kind of activity, the kind of behavioral patterns that you need to exhibit, being in the marketplace, in school, in the workplace, and not just one kind of behavioral niche. So this is associated with the dimensionality of personality. And so you can also think of this as interfaces with some ideas in economics and sociology. So variables like economic complexity, the variety of exports, and how many inputs that are required to produce each output, things like that. So I'm going to skip ahead in the interest of time, but you can think about, just briefly, if you think about the space of all possible environments, and we are actually occupying, let's say, just within your population, however you want to define that, is of course not experiencing all of these, and the yellow part is the one that's being experienced, but through cultural evolution, this environmental distribution is changing over time. So we are changing our own environments. We with scare quotes, of course, there's not necessarily agency at that level, but then hopefully you can see how this links to the self-organizing developmental trajectories that I was talking about with the mice in the enriched environment. And this is only possible because human life history is set for these deep learning environments. So if you look at the nutritional production and consumption in Chimane males versus chimpanzees, you see this enormous difference where there's a surplus only after a certain age in the human males, but it's an enormous surplus. And so it means they can devote much more of your early life to learning. And then Koster et al., Richard McElreath's group, they've also done a very rigorous study across pre-industrial societies in the skill domain, and the average age of peaking in skill in terms of hunting returns is around age 30. And if you look at just the efficiency of hunting, it's actually can be much later, around the 40s. So this is so up to now, I've tried to talk about how the environment is shaping our developmental trajectories. And because the environment is not just a given, we're producing our own environments, partly through the behaviors like these mice, and also partly through cultural transmission, cultural evolution, which also helps create our environments. So now, what kind of there's one more piece to the puzzle. I think this is not enough to explain human open-endedness. And so recently, some groups, most famously Chu, Tenenbaum, and Schultz, they've been talking about how open-endedness is just similar to the Morgan and Feldman paper, but from a completely different field in computational cognitive science, that goal representations are what enable humans to engage in a wide variety of open-ended behavior in an open-ended manner. And this is I guess I can go a bit more in depth after if you have any questions. But in a nutshell, if you look at children's play, so you might have all done this, but if there's a crosswalk, maybe you've done something like, if you just step on the white stripes on the crosswalk, and if you accidentally step off, you die, or something like that. This is a very common thing, right? So human children are very frequently generating these arbitrary systems of rules and following them, and most of them clearly have no utility. But nonetheless, this expands the range of behaviors that we can perform. And the idea here is that ultimately, this opens up a niche in which initially useless pursuits, like polishing this stone to make it like a mirror. So this leads eventually to useful inventions like solar panels and so on. And also, Davidson et al. Also created a very nice way to model, use a generative model to capture human-oriented human generation of open-ended goals. So finally, the idea here, I know that this was sorry, it's my first time giving this a talk, so this last part might have been a bit disconnected, but what I'm trying to explain here is that, okay, so I think you all understand that we can all come up with any arbitrary goals, right? So if I say, okay, I'm gonna do my hand, put my hand here, and clap my hand, you know, like this, then you can do it. This is the action that chimpanzees apparently cannot do. But if we can create our own goals, then this really explodes the range of possible behaviors that you can engage in. So what does it also suggest? It also suggests that we are sensitive to the existence of latent goals. So latent goals are goals that you think exist, but you don't know how to reach yet. But if you increase your skill level, which requires relaxing the degrees of freedom in your motor system, then this will result in your achieving that goal state. And so if you're in a world surrounded by objects that don't make so much sense to you, if you're a 3-year-old and you see all these devices and people doing these things that you cannot do, this is a strong signal, it's a cultural cue that you should not just fix your motor system into some low-dimensional structure in an irreversible way. And so I think this cultural information is the key to open-ended behavior. So the idea here is that culture is facilitating not only imitation, which is often associated with exploitation, but also behavioral exploration as well. And I'm calling this idea teleological depth. So that's your internal representation of the density of latent goals in the environment. And culture serves to signpost these latent goals. So it was a bit of a breeze in the last part. Went through in a bit of a breeze, but thank you very much. I'm based in Singapore, and I would like to talk more about this, or if anyone wants to have ideas for collaboration, I would love to discuss. So thank you very much.
We have time for maybe two or three short questions.
Could you just go back a slide or two? You had a
Yeah.
slide where, yes, the one with the math, where you had the different arithmetic. Yeah, a couple forward. Sorry, forward. It was your last slide. That one. One more. This one.
Yeah.
So
Oh yes.
I found this graph actually kind of fascinating here. This shows that when specific mathematical concepts were discovered, relative to when we teach them to our children.
Yeah.
And it shows a real cool correlation between our development and our evolutionary trajectory.
Yes.
What I'm curious about is 10,000 years ago, were we teaching basic arithmetic to 6-year-olds, or were they learning it at age 20?
Yes, that's a good point. Of course, it's very unlikely that virtually all kids like we have today in most countries are learning arithmetic. That is a big difference. But it's just quite interesting, though, as you say, that this 3,000 years of mathematical innovation. So this is being compressed into the from primary school to end of secondary school. And so we are growing up as kids in an environment where there's already this pre-learned skills and pre-learned knowledge. And so if we're not expecting that, then it's very easy to consolidate our understanding of the world. At least that's what would be expected. And it's a bit of a mystery why we can keep that openness of learning for such a long time, whether in the motor system or in something like mathematics. And so I think there needs to be some kind of information that we're getting from the environment that is shaped by culture, and that is extending our learning period and keeping us. And I think that's probably the basis for the open-endedness of human behavior that has been claimed.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I was curious. It seems like your background is in like human development and like the movement of our bodies. And I was wondering if there was anything about like open-ended evolution of like how we're able to move our bodies or like degrees of freedom of that within like human evolution.
So could you say the last part again?
Yeah, like if there's open-ended evolution, but within like how humans like move and interact with our bodies. Is that a thing or not really?
Yeah, it's so I actually have no background in the movement sciences. This is something I started learning in the last year. But what was striking is that to most people, it's pretty clear that humans move and behave in a different way from other species. But there's no mention of the fact that humans might be different from other species in their motor parameters, their motor structure. And I came to the conclusion that it's because these movement scientists, they often use primates as a model species to study Parkinson's or rehabilitation, right? And if you say that actually the human motor system is different from these animals, how do you get funding for these model animals? So that's why a conspiracy theory for why movement scientists refuse to say anything about how humans might be different from chimpanzees or macaques. Yeah, so there's nothing in the literature basically about evolution. I mean, of course there is in a more broad sense, but.
Cool. Thank you guys very much for the questions. So we're going to take a 10-minute break now and then start the second half. The second half is going to be an interactive activity to kind of think through cultural evolution, and it will involve kind of like group work. So if you're totally not into that, then I suggest not sticking around. Maybe you might find something else. But if that sounds like fun to you, then feel, of course, we would enjoy it if you stay. I think during the break, maybe Sue, if you want to explain, we have a kind of a question to ask you guys.
Yeah. So this is a fun, well, a quiz just to see what you think about what are the key ingredients of cultural evolution, which I will put up now. Can we see that? Yeah, so it's a Menti quiz, and if you just go to menti.com and type in this code, you can submit answers and it will show up in a brainstorm. So yeah, let's see what you guys think.
Cool. Let's give another round of applause for Argentina. And
Oh, okay.
Okay, cool. So, hi everyone, welcome back to session 2 of our workshop. Now we have 3 really great flash talks, all on the topic of cultural evolution. And these were from accepted abstracts. And yeah, the first is Naomi, who will be speaking on
the sociality of creativity with AI. So
yeah, you can get started.
Thank you. So my name is Naomi. I'll be presenting very quickly my research on AI simulation of creativity. So my work is based on Csikszentmihalyi's systems model of creativity, and this is the overall structure of the model. So we have 3 parts: culture, the domain, the field, and the individual, and all parts interact with each other, and they basically grow and evolve alongside. In the setting of my experiments, the domain was defined as just recent modern times. It's a highly competitive industry, and people are strict, and we have a list of significant artworks in this domain. So The artists create artifacts. The critic then gives the evaluation. This evaluation is used to then update the domain in the ranking of the artifacts. And then the feedback is also passed on to the artists that can then change their own strategy in how they can create new artifacts. And this is just like a very summarized overview of what I got in the simulations. So at the top, you can find the descriptions for each agent. At the top, we have the two field agents. They are both critics or mentors. One is defined as like very helpful. The other one is defined as very strict. The two artists I define mostly as very passionate artists, but one is not very good at it, but very passionate, and the second one just wants to become very famous. And you can see the difference in the quality, I guess, of the artifacts that they generated. So the first one, it looks more like very childish, very amateurish, while the second one, you can see more like abstract painting and more like non-traditional, I guess, images. So some interesting observations that I made, because the artists were able to communicate with each other after receiving the feedback, is the first one is interesting how the LLM assign personalities to the artists. So the first artist that is not very good at it was then, it was inferred that it's enthusiastic, and then the artist that wants to be famous was then defined as a little arrogant. And also oh, sorry, ding ding. Ding ding. Yeah, but if you just read through these are some of the cool products of the interaction between the artists that I found in the simulations. If you want to talk to me later, I can just show these slides.
Thank you, Mary.
Should I just?
Yeah. Okay. So our next flash talk will be Eleni. He's talking about evolving protocols for LLMs. Just bear with us while we set up. Great. Over to you.
Good afternoon. I will talk to you about our work on improving the innovation abilities of collectives, be it artificial or natural, by orchestrating their social dynamics. So culture, the things you learn in interaction with others, is not unique in humans. There are species, for example, that can learn how to use tools by observing others. But what is unique about human culture is its complexity. If we look at records of our innovations, and we'll see that there's this evolutionary looking structure where innovations arise by combining previous one and accumulating with time. And many studies have tried to understand what makes us unique. And they have looked at properties of both individuals and collectives. And at the collective level, we often look at the social connectivity of the group, like who communicates with whom. And in our group, we think that now is a particularly interesting time for human cultural evolution. And something we have been working on is how the introduction of algorithms such as generative AI has been changing its dynamics. So we've been using this game that you can play online. It's called Little Alchemy 2. And you're given some items and you can combine them in pairs to make new items. And it has many interesting features, one of which is that there is a presence of local optima. Like there's many possible trajectories you can follow as you're exploring, and sometimes you're stuck somewhere, and the only way to get out is to get items from another faraway trajectory. And the way we play this collectively is that we have multiple agents that are all players. They all play in their own copy of the environment. They have their own inventory, and they also maintain a memory of their past successful and unsuccessful interactions. And they communicate by sharing memories. And what we wanted to do is find an automated way to find good ways to communicate. So basically, we want to decide when to share with whom and which memories. And for this, we have used recently popularized approach where you use a large language model as an evolutionary operator. So we call these communication ways protocols, and we encode them in Python code, and then we start the search with some simple structure. Then we provide an existing protocol to an LLM, and we ask it to improve it. And whatever it gives us, we use it to simulate a game. And if it performs well, and if it's sufficiently diverse from what we already had, then we keep it. And then in this way, we find a protocol that performs better than some used in previous works. For example, if you communicate in a fully connected way, everyone communicates with everyone all the time, then that's good at the beginning because it propagates information quickly, but then it also reduces the diversity. So you converse a local optimal, whereas if you have a dynamic group, which is a group that is spread into subgroups, and then once in a while you have some visits, that's better in the long term. And we see that by having a more fine-grained control over how we communicate, we achieve a better performance. And this was done in a simulation with simple artificial agents. And the next thing that we want to do is see whether these protocols, they generalize to human populations by doing an online study with human and human LLM players. Was I too quick?
Great, amazing. Thank you, Eleni. So our last talk will be by Till Aus from the University of Konstanz. And he couldn't attend today, but he has recorded a talk for us. Here we go. Let me just share that. I'm not used to the Mac.
Hello, my name is Till Aus. I'm a PhD student in Heiko Hammann's lab, and today I will give you a short presentation of our work titled Perceiving the Culture of Machines, Human Responses to Culturally Evolved Robot Swarms. In the future, collaboration between human operators and robot swarms will become increasingly important, but how these swarms are perceived can have a critical impact on the operator's well-being, as well as on collaboration performance, things like openness to collaborate and acceptance of the system. These differences in perception may actually stem from different socialization backgrounds. Our vision is therefore to develop an adaptable swarm system with a continuous feedback loop. The primary goal is to optimize the human well-being while also improving task performance and supporting behavioral diversity for exploration. To achieve this, we want feedback to be collected seamlessly, so we make use of physiological data of the human operator. For this system, we identify two essential submodules which can be developed and tested independently. The first is the human operator state model. Its purpose is to map physiological and behavioral data to the operator's well-being. To achieve this, we plan experiments with pre-configured robot controllers at different levels of diversity by tracking the operator's state through physiological measures and questionnaires. For modeling, we rely on supervised machine learning. But there are still some open questions. For example, which tasks should the swarm solve? How exactly should the operator interact? And how do we design and evaluate behavioral diversity? The second submodule is cultural online evolution. Here, the goal is to adapt swarm behavior online based on feedback from the human operator state model. We distinguish two levels, a faster process of social learning and a slower generational learning process, which should be guided by human operator input. Again, similar questions arise. Which metrics are best for capturing diversity, task performance, and operator well-being? From this study, we expect several intermediate insights that will help us move toward our overarching goal, a real-time feedback loop that adapts swarm behavior to improve operator well-being, making human swarm interaction smoother and more efficient. The first insight we aim for is understanding the perception of swarm diversity. We expect to find a trade-off between low and high diversity swarms in terms of how people perceive performance and engagement. The second step is to map these findings onto physiological data. This would allow us to automatically predict perception, which is a crucial step toward closing the feedback loop. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And if something comes to your mind later, please feel free to reach out to me either via Zoom or directly by email. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Atul. So I think in the interest of time, we'll skip Q&A. But if you are interested in talking to speakers, they're here to catch them at the end of the workshop. And now, just as a bit of a surprise, we initially invited Alan Winfield to speak at this workshop, but he couldn't attend. So Alan is a professor of robot ethics at the University West of England, I think now retired. But he did some initial work on artificial culture for robot swarms. And yeah, he kindly recorded some thoughts for us on artificial creativity.
Hello, I'm so sorry I cannot be with you in person or online. I shall be flying back from Australia on the date of your workshop. But the subject of the workshop, emergent creativity and the wisdom of the crowds, is deeply interesting. Indeed, not long after we completed the Artificial Culture project, I spent a good deal of time thinking about artificial creativity. But first we need to ask the question, what is natural creativity? Many years ago, I read Arthur Koestler's magnificent book, The Act of Creation. In that book, Koestler defines creativity as structurally the same as telling a joke. The difference, as he memorably put it, between ha-ha and aha. Most jokes have a setup which tells a concise story that sets an expectation, followed by a punchline which subverts the expectation with a twist. The key to a good joke is misdirection. Lead the audience to assume a line of reasoning, then flip it unexpectedly. The psychological reaction is, of course, laughter. Koestler argues that if the setup and punchline instead offer a novel conjunction of ideas that makes sense, that is, aha, the act of creation. So, with a theory of creativity, can we build a creative robot or agent? Well, no. The problem with building a creative agent based on Koestler's theory is that the agent would not be able to tell the difference between ha-ha and aha. Ha-ha invokes surprise, which is an emotion. Eureka moments also invoke feelings. And we have no idea how to build emotional artificial agents, agents that really feel feelings. I hope these brief thoughts might be helpful to your workshop. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. So hopefully that's some inspiration on creativity leading on to the next and final part of our workshop, which will be an interactive game.
Cool. Thanks a lot, guys, for sticking around for this final bit. Just of a show of hands, I wanted to ask how many of you guys are computer scientists? How many of you guys are like biologists? How many of you guys are psychologists? What else do we have? What other fields are here?
Designer.
Designer, okay.
Technically games designer.
Games designer, okay, cool. All right, so definitely a mixture. So I'm a biologist. I come to culture from the point of behavioral ecology, the perspective of behavioral ecology. And this was a game that we all designed together to kind of get you guys thinking about how maybe other perspectives think about culture outside of ALIFE, and introduce you to some of the kind of core concepts and core questions of what biologists and psychologists think about when they're thinking about culture. And so the challenge here is to create some kind of plausible cultural trait for a generated organism. So this is kind of like a generative activity that we're going to do, and you'll see what I mean when we get to it. And these cultures are going to help these organisms survive and reproduce and exploit resources, which are the three really important things that life does. And so the goal of this game is to give you some space to have like creative thinking and encourage a deeper understanding of what culture is, what constrains culture, and how culture might change in natural or in artificial systems. Oops, sorry, I should have previewed the slide. So just to kind of summarize what was said in the first half by our two keynote speakers. So culture is broadly defined as things like behaviors. Oftentimes, so I'm from an animal behavior perspective, I study the spread of behaviors. From the human side, we can study the spread of values or beliefs. There can be adaptive strategies that spread through populations, or ideas or ideas that can spread through populations. And the important thing about culture is that it can be passed on from generation to generation in this kind of iterated transmission process through what we call social transmission. And the important thing is that culture can evolve over time, both in response to external pressures from perhaps the environment that might be acting on culture, but also internal pressures such as cognitive biases, things like this that can influence the actual usage of culture. And to just give you kind of a broad idea of the different domains where we can study animal culture. So one thing is nest building. So there's been shown that things like the materials that they use, the nest site selection, so where they decide to build these nests, are learned from the observation of what others do. Another major example, which I think was brought up in the previous talks, is the vocal learning in humpbacked males, which functions to attract a mate. So it's one of these interesting things that is socially learned, but is also sexually selected for. And oftentimes, like birdsong is kind of the same way. You get these kind of two pressures acting on it. And finally, an interesting example are the tool manufacture and use of foraging implements. So these little sticks that these Caledonian crows use to hunt for hidden insects and things. So from my perspective, I study culture in these birds. So these are the great tit. This is kind of a well-known study system in the field of animal culture. And that's because they can socially learn to use these foraging puzzles. So this video is taken from a recent experiment. The experiment's not published yet, but it illustrates this type of artificial culture, which I can induce in these populations using these puzzle boxes. And so I'll play that again. So the puzzle box just has a sliding door that you can move to the left or right, and the birds will get a reward when they move that door. If you teach one bird how to use that puzzle and release them into a population, other birds start learning how to use the puzzle by watching that first bird use the puzzle. So culture is not only natural, but culture can also be artificially induced, which is a really useful strategy to study it in wild populations. And importantly, for culture to be passed, it needs to go through this kind of bottleneck of transmission. And social transmission can be defined as when the acquisition of information or a behavioral trait by one individual exerts a positive causal influence on the rate at which another acquires the same information or trait. This is basically saying the more connections you have to informed individuals, the more likely you are to also become informed or adopt the behavior or something like this, right? So this is a really kind of abstract definition, which can abstract over the many different types of mechanisms that might be responsible. But the important thing here that I want to highlight is that things like environmental constraints, social constraints, and individual cognitive constraints all affect the size of this bottleneck, right? So for example, if you have a really tiny memory, you can only remember the last 10 seconds. This is an extreme constraint on social transmission because whatever is transmitted needs to stay in your, like, it needs to happen like very quickly, right, for things to transfer. So these kind of details about species can affect how cultures spread.
And so, yeah, just to give you an idea, so when I think about the types of cognitive constraints about culture, things like what directs your attention or attentional biases can potentially affect the spread of culture, because if you, for example, you don't pay attention to certain other individuals, you wouldn't learn anything from them, right? So this is a barrier. The other thing is the perception, which is slightly different but inverted. So like, for example, if you perceive certain individuals to be maybe more influential or something like this, or if you literally perceive, I don't know, you kind of distort, I could imagine some species might distort other individuals so they become very large or whatever on their mental stage. Perhaps this could affect the spread of culture. Also memory, as I already said, and also the biases and the rules that govern the production or the usage of behavior, because it's the production of a behavior that leads to the next transmission event, right? So production necessarily affects transmission. And put in a different way, we can imagine culture moving from these internal representations of behaviors to external expressions of behaviors, which are then kind of like the substrate for future inference about those things, right? So this kind of iterated process of internal and external representation is something that's very important for how cultures can change. Because you can imagine if there's any bias in the production or any bias in the inference, this can lead to gradual changes in culture over time. In terms of social constraints, I'll just show you, this is from a model that was demonstrating how important movement can be for transmission, and how movement, when you explicitly account for it, can fundamentally change how behaviors spread through populations, and it creates predictions that wouldn't necessarily be made just by looking at static networks alone. Another type of social constraint is competition, for example. So this is from a different experiment. And you can see that one bird solved the puzzle, and these other two birds came immediately after and tried to scrounge a worm from the puzzle and got into a competitive interaction. If they didn't get into that competitive interaction, one of them might have been able to interact maybe more frequently or for a longer period of time with the puzzle, and that could have sped up the social transmission of this type of behavior. And finally, environmental constraints. This is a video that was, oh, I forgot that was done. There's a video that was recorded by two field assistants that were working on field season that I did in Australia, where we were basically looking for examples of spin opening behavior by big birds with self-reflective processes. And the spin opening behavior, we've inferentially, we've shown statistically that it's likely that this behavior is being socially learned. We still don't fully understand how and when it's being learned. But critically, this behavior relies on the existence of resources, which are the trash bins in the environment, right? So these birds can only produce this behavior one time per week, and that's bin day, when they put out the bins. And they can only produce it early in the morning before the bins get collected, right? And so this is an extreme environmental constraint on transmission, because you only have this behavior occurring extremely locally, right? So usually when we think about culture from a human perspective, we're imagining this, I mean, we live in an online world. We have information that's permanently available any time of the day. But for animals, this is an extreme constraint. And so, yeah, you guys were both bringing up before, why don't animals have complex cultures? I think the cognitive, social, and environmental constraints, these are the three key kind of ingredients for as to why. Right, so I've kind of given you a broader overview of the things that biologists might think about when they're thinking about culture. And so for this activity, we're going to go ahead and give you a worksheet, and the activity is going to take place basically over 4 iterated rounds, where you're going to come up with a species and their physical attributes. You're going to come up with a habitat where that species lives, what type of social organization they have, their social behavior, and what types of cognitive abilities that they have. And then this will lead to a discussion. So maybe we can go ahead and, well, actually, no. Let me explain. So this is the sheet. Basically, the rounds will move like this. So we start in round 1, where you're going to describe the physical attributes. Maybe if you'd like to draw, you could draw a little picture of your animal, and then you're going to pass the piece of paper to the person sitting next to you. That person sitting next to you is going to fill in the habitat of that animal, and then the social behavior, and then pass the paper, and then you see what I mean. So by the end, you'll have kind of a random assortment of traits about that organism. And then you're going to kind of brainstorm what kind of cultural trait might you imagine this organism could have. And for each round, so we're going to give you a few minutes to fill out each of these things. We'll put up this sign and ask you guys to pass the papers. So to do this, I want to arrange you guys in groups of 4. So if you could go ahead and maybe self-organize that. Maybe I see like 4, there's 4 of you guys in the back, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 of you guys there, there's 4 of you guys there, and maybe this can be a group here. How did you come up with this game? I didn't actually. So this has been an iterative process. So this was originally designed by Sue and Khalud and David. And then they brought me in, and then we did a few practice rounds and slowly developed it into what it is now. So, but it's the first time I'm doing it, so let's see if it's let's see if it works. Yeah. All right, guys. So everybody has a paper? Yes? Everybody has like a pencil, something to write with? Pencil or pen? Okay, good. So the first round is going to be focused on the physical attributes. So you guys can choose either like a standard life form, or you can pick, I don't know, some type of maybe artificial life. This is kind of up to you. So I would pick kind of a category of organism. And then think about things like what is their size, what is their body composition, maybe how do they move, if they have any interesting developmental stages. I don't know, you can use your imagination to come up with something. I think I'm going to give you guys maybe 7 to 10 minutes to do this, and we'll kind of keep track of how many of you guys are finishing, and then I'll ask you to then pass the paper afterwards. So just think about very broadly, what does your organism look like? How do they move? How big are they? Are they huge elephant sized, or are they microbes? Something like this. Okay, ready? Go. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Is the real species or
no?
Artificial.
Totally. It can be an artificial species. It can be like a biological, like made up species. It could be a real species if you really want to use a real species. But it's kind of up to your imagination what you come up with. I suggest you don't need to write in full sentences. Just make kind of notes, because the next person is going to have to understand. Please remember, you're only filling out the first box. Don't fill out the rest of the boxes. So if you finish, you can spend time drawing a nice little picture of your animal. Yeah, we should have put music. Probably gotten back something that you may not recognize. What we want to do now is to have you guys stand up and organize into pairs based on the type of environment that you've chosen. So if I can go back to the environments. Okay, so maybe to make this easier, I'll just have you guys raise your hand. Who is freshwater? Nobody. Okay. Who? It'll be freshwater. We have one freshwater. Do we have any wetlands? No. Okay, you're by yourself. You're wetland. Okay, so two of you guys pair. Perfect. Temperate and boreal forest. You picked a forest? Yeah. Okay, there's three of you. Is anyone a rainforest? There's quite a few rainforests. Can one rainforest convert to temperate forest and then you guys make two pairs? Yeah, okay, maybe let's all like stand up and start moving around the room so that you can go chat with each other. So forest people maybe go over on that side. Wetland, the water people are in the back. Tundra and Arctic. Tundra, no, nobody, okay. Rainforest. There were a bunch of rainforest people. Where did they all go? Did they all go over there? Okay, they can organize themselves. Mountains. One. Oh, okay. Grasslands and savanna. Right, those two things are sometimes next to each other, so you guys can go. Yeah, you guys can go feel each other. What about desert and steppe? There's 4 of you, so go ahead and stand up and organize into pairs. And then finally, marine. I guess the remainder of you. So if you guys can go ahead and stay in pairs. Space. Space. Oh shit. Okay. That's sort of marine. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like you could say deep ocean and maybe it's very similar. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so once you've found yourself a partner, go ahead and just sit down because I'm going to have you guys chat with each other. So find a partner and take a seat next to each other.
Are we splitting them into pairs?
Yeah, in pairs. I want you guys to work in pairs. Work in pairs. Work in, yeah, you just that's it. You just work in pairs. Okay, so the final part of this is the tough part. So it's imagining what's a plausible culture that these organisms could have, right? So you have these super weird organisms with different weird social structures and body structures and also environments. So I want you to first work with your partner to come up with some kind of plausible culture that you could write in. And so to remind you guys, culture in animal species can be in a diverse, like basically any behavioral domain could support culture potentially, right? So oftentimes there's quite a few foraging behaviors, so you could think about the types of resources in that environment. Maybe there are some that are really difficult to exploit and they would need some kind of innovation to be able to defeat that. Also could be reproductive behavior, for example. Maybe they have I don't know, a cultural breeding ground that they go to. So it's kind of up to you. So think through these different types of examples of culture that we've talked about today and come up with something that makes sense for your weird animals that you've come up with. Okay, and please work with your partner because it's difficult. So you guys can be like, does that make sense? No, I don't know. That doesn't make sense.
Are we exchanging with partners or?
No. You're working. So you're working on your own, but you can just work on one at a time. So maybe discuss each in turn. Yeah.
Okay, I first had to read
Okay, we have 20 minutes. Yeah, so I'm gonna interrupt them in 5 minutes and then tell them to think about the remainder of these questions on the board, and then maybe, I don't know, at the end, that's kind of hard to wrap it up, so I was thinking somebody wants to describe their organism, their culture, or something like that. Okay. Okay. Maybe we need to organize.
Because they just buy yeah, they definitely are predators. It's our habitat. It's super sparse. I mean, it's super sparse. They have to have really optimized for everything.
Yeah, so I spent 3 years insects exactly.
I guess kind of different, right? Because they're very dependent to not over but I guess it has to be kind of different relationship.
Well, that's the question of the contract.
To engage with each other, to learn how to grow around the others. Otherwise, they will not get together. That's the other bad yeah, I guess maybe because they just don't the differences in perception between the two really have but they can kind of use each other like tools. So I guess my utility oriented. I guess, yeah, also I guess if you all not together, communication also kind of like and maybe there's kind of like, I can imagine that it's possible, like make each other and throw each other around. And then, yeah, I guess, behavior. And I think they're not focused on me, just like throwing each other around, like and exploring the what was the yeah. I guess that makes sense. Like the younger generations would not anymore. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hurting or killing. Even during play or during yeah. Yeah, I can say
Yeah. Please go ahead, and let me give you a microphone.
Should we explain the whole species?
Yeah, just a broad overview, and then what the cultural trait is would be good. Yeah.
So it's the phantom. It's the phantom bear, and it looks like a super big bear. It's like 2 meters, but it has a shell like a tortoise, and it uses this shell to roll around on it. It can also walk, but it's basically mostly rolling on the shell. And it lives in the desert, where it has a lot of space, and it lives in smaller groups, where the youngest, there's the alpha leader, and this is due to being young means also you can be like greatly thrown around, which is their hunting technique. So they throw around the others to roll and to then kill the prey, which leads to a predator-prey relationship in their environment. So they are not that good at communicating, and also they have problems with the theory of mind, since when they have negative feelings, they just hide in the shell. And so they never really develop. But they do develop this kind of complicated hunting behavior through play, because they just play around and throw around each other, growing up and exploring the motor range. And so this is how this complicated behavior then happens. Yeah, the problem is if they play too hard, or also during the hunting, and they actually hurt each other, or especially those individuals that are thrown around. And since they focus on the younger individuals, because they're good to be thrown, it is great for them to get new hunters, but they are kind of bad at retaining the existing good hunters, since they grow up and then it doesn't work anymore, and so a bit of a problem at retention there. And if there would be any problem taking away the space for them to roll around, their whole society would, crash.
Okay, and what's the cultural trait?
Sorry?
What's the cultural trait?
Throwing technique.
The throwing
technique.
Okay, so the actual throwing technique.
Yeah,
okay, nice.
exactly.
Yeah, I like that.
And we would study them from below with a see-through floor to not disrupt the processes and but still view the trajectories of rolling, which differ per individual.
Nice. Wow, you guys really thought deeply into the study design and stuff. Okay, that's awesome. I mean, that's a really kind of rich species that was generated, and yeah, okay, sure. It could totally be the case that, well, they're not so good at communication, but maybe they could learn techniques because they have some type of extended developmental period where they spend a long time together. Or maybe they learn it by being thrown, right? So if you're thrown, you get this like kinetic feedback or something.
Yeah,
maybe
they have great motor skills and self-perception.
I see, okay, yeah.
But they accidentally kill each other a lot because they've got no theory of mind.
Okay.
So they have no idea how it would affect the others. So it's a bit of a drawback.
We want to share ours.
Okay, sure, yeah, go for it.
Ours has a literal name, nano robots, and 1 to 10 microns in length. Recycled electronics, but they also have a cell membrane, laser-based propulsion. That's sort of the key behavior, and they're unicellular, laser-propelled organisms, nano robot organisms. They live underwater. They procreate using microplastics and electronic waste. And they deter predators with their laser-based propulsion. They live in large social groups, but they're solitary foragers. And they also use their lasers to hunt by creating laser nets. I don't know how you create a laser net being a solitary forager, but laser nets.
I guess if they're densely enough packed into an area or something.
They have a good motor skill. They can move 10 meters in 1 second. It's fast.
It's very fast.
That theory of mind. The culture is like those rams that are headbutting. They play a game of chicken, so with their lasers, 10 meters per second. And so we have a payoff matrix with stop, don't stop. Then the cultural transmission of the strategy in the game of chicken. And also, so it's like a hawk dove thing where no one wants to get hit, but if everyone's doing that, then some of them just go and they get that extra 1 point.
I see.
But they also signal the cultural transmission is also the signal of commitment. And I'm definitely not going to stop, so you better stop and get out of the way. Yeah.
That's very good. Super cool. So I hope you guys had fun coming up with like all of these different ideas. I just wanted to really quickly talk about, well, I don't know, I figured that a lot of people here might be working in modeling or even maybe game design. This might be relevant. So when you think about if you wanted to model something like culture, I think it's really handy to keep in mind, particularly the cognitive constraints that you can implement in your agents. And if you could imagine that the values for each of these types of things or biases applied to each of these types of things could result in cultural change over time. We didn't have too much time to get into it, but we have a very short amount of time anyways. Yeah, I mean, I hope that maybe you're inspired or think differently about how culture is. So culture really is, like we were saying, this kind of bottom-up process where you have these interacting individuals, and really the aspects of not only what's going on in the individuals' minds, but also how they interact with each other, and also the environment that they live in make a huge difference to the types of cultures that can be supported. And with that, I think we're going to kind of come to the end, but not quite. So I guess before we completely wrap up, yeah, maybe Sud, if you want to come up and we can say thank you to the people who have supported this.
Yeah. So first, thanks to Michael for facilitating the game. He's really the perfect person for the job. And yeah, thanks to all you guys for showing up and taking an interest in cultural evolution. It's been really cool to see such a big crowd, and I hope, yeah, you had fun playing the game. Hope you took something from the keynote talks as well. Feel free to keep these sheets as souvenirs. We also have some freebies over there on this table if you'd like, and keep the pencils as well. But yeah, so this is the organizing team. It's not just me and Michael, it's just that we're here in person. David and Khulud have been online. I think Sabine joined for a little bit. And like I said, we're sponsored by AI for CI. So thanks to them for their support. Yeah, and also Emerge and the collective behavior cluster at Constance. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks for playing along. So before we kind of like disperse back into the conference, I thought it would be cool if everybody could bring their creatures over to this back table and set them out on the table. It would be great if you could kind of cluster yours in the habitats where they live in, so all of the, I don't know, marine creatures are together or something like that. And then we want to take a photo of this to have. So yeah, that's the last thing we ask you to do. Thank you so much for playing. Cool. Oh, nice. Okay, that's great. I'm glad that it was Thanks a lot. Yeah.
I think warning people who were going to do it helped, because the other people who stayed were the ones.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was a bit worried when I came back and there were only like a handful of people. I was like, oh, maybe I should have joined them, but then more people showed up. And, I think with a few more people, it was really a nightmare. So would it be possible?